Good evening. Just wanted to say what a lovely thing this is. An O with umlauts for ears, our little friend. And we altered our first slide very subtly to reflect that. So a couple of warnings, first of all. This talk may contain knots. And it's quite important to say this. We're not typographers and we're not type designers. We're graphic designers who are interested in working with type and systems.
Can I just chip in? The reason our talk is called Machine Tools is because we're interested in the grid of the page or the screen, the structure of the communication, and the way in which every subcomponent, every small element of that is a part of that assembly. So we're interested in the micro and macro level of things. This is the only slide we're going to show you this evening. We're going to talk for 3 hours around this. This sums up absolutely everything about what we do. So we're only interested in either making the mark or not making the mark. We're only interested in either going forward or aborting.
Yeah.
And our collaboration is that narrow grey area in the middle where we argue endlessly.
Yeah. And we'll probably end up arguing soon on stage, we hope. The subtitle for our talk was Visual Engineering. We're very interested in the way that things are built, the way that you can make things with small components and scale them up to create systems. So these are just some of the sorts of systems that we work with, and are kind of quite a good representation of the way we think about what we do. But it's not to do with the system itself. The system is only a means to an end. What we're interested in doing is getting to a point where we can start to make things with the tools that we've built. And we are interested in type and language. So all of these systems that we talk about and work on are ways of getting towards making a different kind of typography.
The tradition that we're working within is kind of at variance with what I think is fashionable nowadays. We're really interested in the idea of visual communications being in some way systematic or mechanized rather than humanistic, perhaps. And here is just a quick snapshot of a loose partial chronology of the things that we pay reference to. So it really goes back to the 1690s when letterform was first completely divorced from the hand and turned into something quite mechanistic and measured and mathematical, despite the fact that the typeface is very ugly and displeasing. It's a very interesting starting point. And that led to the modern typefaces by Dido and Bodoni and Walbaum and many others. And that mechanistic approach is really largely inherited from things like stencil lettering, where for the first time, instead of thinking about a relationship between these forms and handwriting, the letters are broken down, split into component parts. And that developed in the late 19th century with things like the Plaque de Coupe Universelle, De Stiel lettering by Van Doesburg, and then later on Bart van der Lek, work done at the Bauhaus by people like Joseph Albers and Herbert Bayer, more Herbert Bayer, Paul Renner's Futura from the 1920s, Cassandra working with Biffer, Din, a much more worthy, much more functional approach to the same concept, the notion of letterforms being units in a system of difference. An anonymous designer from Niblo in Italy with the beautiful Fregio Meccano, which is a letterform that's entirely assembled from pieces of typographic furniture rather than typography itself. Lettering designed for cathode ray tubes or liquid crystal displays, experimental lettering from the 60s. This is by some designers from Britain. Universe, in which the body of the letter is quite human humanistic, but the notion of weight increment is purely systematized in a very carefully structured way. And then, of course, all of the work of Wim Crowell is something that we regard as an absolute pivotal point in the history of this sort of system.
And I think, I mean, Crowell is a really good example because he's definitely not a type designer. He is a graphic designer. And I think what's interesting about a lot of these systems types is that they were engineered by people who were not letterform designers, which kind of makes them sort of accessible, and you don't need to know all the intricacies of proper type design. And I guess that's really where we stand in a way. Although Paul is quite a skilled type designer, I'm certainly not.
And what we're saying is very heretical and very much at variance with the current trend towards very sophisticated humanistic letterforms. This brutal mathematical approach to the letter is not something that is particularly fashionable today. Baby Teeth by Milton Glaser, the extraordinary Chicago typeface, which is kind of unlovable visually, but incredibly clever in the way in which it structured the early screens of the Macintosh. The innovative work by Zuzana Lischko at Emigre with her Citizen typeface and various others. Pierre de Sculio's Minimum, which is about as minimal as you can get in a letter form. Janussi Smith's Mies, which is a typeface in which resolution and speed of transmission is offset against the complexity of the contour of the letter. And finally, in recent times, Norm's Replica, which sort of amalgamates the two approaches. It seeks to create a harmonious-looking letter, but using some really basic and raw mathematics. These are the things we most admire.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about our roots to working together. There's a pun there, by the way. Ha, ha, ha. No? Good. So I spent a long time working in a very non-systematic way where everything was driven by aesthetics. And that was from 1985. I formed, with Mark Holt and Simon Johnston, a company called APO. We were based in London. And our starting point was that we hated everything that was happening in British design at the time, mainly because we'd all either studied or worked outside the UK. Mark had worked for 4 years in San Francisco. Simon and I had both been to the Basel School of Design and studied under Weingart Hoffmann and Andre Gertler, among others. And I think you'll see in the 8VO work the influence of, the Basel School. So we started out in 1985, and about the only thing that drove us was a kind of a hatred of a lot of the stuff that was going on at the time. So the first person was her, which is quite obvious. There was lots of that going on. The Tories were selling off all the state monopolies. And design companies were designing massive corporate identities for millions of pounds for these people. And then they were listing themselves on the stock market. I mean, what a mad idea. The Britishness of British design, that's obvious. And that's sort of, the way that type was treated often in Britain, which was very ideas-led and image-driven. Typography was just relegated to being the label for something. Big ideas, we could never have big ideas, so we were really, hated big ideas and the influence of Bob Gill, and also we hated the work of the other Gill. We also really hated illustration, sorry to all the illustrators here, and serifs, terrible, terrible things. And the Face magazine, and Neville Brody, and all that represented. So that's what got us going. This is a quote, I don't know when it was said, but we said it. I won't read it out, but it just reinforces that idea that our approach was about type first, and typography second, and image sometimes. So we did a lot of work for Factory Records and the Hacienda nightclub in Manchester. These are posters for their annual birthday parties. We also designed record sleeves for Factory for the Duriti column. And then we also published a journal, Octavo. 8VO is the abbreviation of Octavo, which is a printing term, which I won't go into now. You can look it up if you're interested. I'm sure you're not. It's a bit, what's the word? Boring? No.
Sorry, I wasn't listening.
Oh. Right, first argument coming up. You know, when something's like very focused and nerdy and horrible and...
Typography.
That's it, yeah. Typographic. So Octavo was self-financed, self-published. I don't know why we did it. Looking back now, I don't know how 3 28, 29-year-old designers who just started an office thought that they had the right to publish a serious journal about typography, but we did it, you know. And it lasted for, it was meant to last for 4 years with one issue every 6 months. It was always designed to self-destruct, so that there would ever only be 8 issues. And really that's kind of, along with the work that we were doing for people like Factory, this established us as, you know, I don't know, people, we had a fan base, people bought the thing. It sold to designers. We eventually sold out of every issue, which was good. And then later on, we'll get there in a minute, but this is the kind of madness that we got ourselves involved in the end. So this is a mad form of making. It's like torture. I still don't know why we did it. We did it because we could, because by this time, early 90s, there were typesetting systems where you could typeset whole A3 spreads in position, and you could do all this fancy stuff. So we thought, well, if you can do it, let's try it.
You didn't do it in a Mac?
No, that was all, no Mac at all. Some of these were done on the Mac. So this is another, well, for the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, Octavo was a terrible thing. It was never designed as an office brochure, and in fact we learned not to show it to potential clients because it just frightened them. They didn't know what they were looking at. But the only person who did understand it among our clients or potential clients was Wim Kral, who was by this time in 1989 director of the Museum Boijmans in Rotterdam, and he hired 8VO to work on all the posters and catalogues for the museum. So over 5 years we designed, I think, 40 posters and 50 catalogues. But as you can see, it's all to do with type, it's all to do with language, some of it's type and image. But mostly it was about the aesthetics. And then we kind of disappeared up our own fundament in about 1991 when we did this brochure for a German pre-press company. So this was all specified for typesetting on a Berthold M system. So we were engineers. We had to tell the typesetters what we wanted to the nearest hundredth of a millimeter. But it started getting a bit kind of boring, really, and we lost our way. So Mark and I started thinking about how we could employ more systematic approaches to our design. So these posters for a music festival in Edinburgh use a kind of the notion of the page as a grid where all the type sizes have to relate to each other. So it's kind of mathematics driving the aesthetics. So these are some close-up shots of the screen-printed posters which show the unit relationship between the various sizes of type. So the poster consists of one unit, basically, which is scaled up and multiplied to create the whole environment. And by driving a design in that way, you stop thinking about what you like and what you don't like, and you have to start accepting what the system you've designed will give you, which is kind of really interesting because you stop having big arguments about whether it's good or bad. It's mostly bad, and you just have to accept it.
You have to like it.
And like it, yeah. And then another approach to design, well, I was going to say design thinking, but as I've been very vocal recently about saying what a stupid term I think it is, I shouldn't have. But the notion of designing a machine to design something rather than designing the thing itself. So this is another thing for the Flux Festival. And we had to come up with a way of designing a poster very quickly because we were only going to get the final text for the poster the evening before it had to go to press the next day. So we designed a container, if you like, and a system of typographic hierarchy into which we could kind of pour the content at the end, turn the handle, and out comes the poster with minimal intervention. But it's interesting because that grey stripe that we showed you before, the temptation is to go into that grey area and to say, I don't like that rag or that line break, and it's a really fascinating thing. You set up these systems and then you start think, I just want to change it a bit, you know. So it can be quite, well, yes, interesting, if you like that kind of thing. Over to Mr. McNeil.
Okay, thank you, Hamish. I think following Hamish is a really tough act to follow. When Hamish was doing those interesting things, I was working for really large corporations doing brand identity work. Organizations with names like these.
Didn't you build a machine for making these?
I have to tell you, I've made all this up. I didn't work for any of these organizations. But shortly after deciding to stop working for them and to start to do more interesting things and start to develop my own sense of an aesthetic rather than theirs, I produced that piece of work, which is actually a syllabary. Each of the sections divided with the blue vertical lines is a separate keystroke, a separate component. And I assembled it as a kit of parts, as a sort of parody of corporate life, where people could invent their own corporate brand name by mixing up these highly appropriate symbols. Now, what's very relevant about them is, interestingly, they're all either Latin or Greek. There's nothing Germanic or Anglo-Saxon. There's no bum or we or poo in any of these names, which maybe that's the new way forward for corporations of the new millennium. In addition to designing the syllabary, I also designed the letter forms for that in a system which is called Core, which is a sort of ongoing thing I've been developing for the past decade, I guess. And the concept for it came from a quote from Ellen Lupton in a book, in a piece called The Natural History of Typography, where she says, a canon of ideally proportioned letter forms has yielded to a flexible genetic code capable of breeding an infinity of new species. And she was talking in 1993 about the advent of computing.
Sorry, I don't understand that.
Well, I'll explain it then.
Later.
No, now.
Oh, no.
No, we've got 3 hours.
Well, you might have. I need to be
in essence, the notion that she was making a claim for was that the computer created fluidity in letter form, which previously had been rigidly held by photocomposition or mechanical composition or cold metal composition. But when you think about it hard, and when you look at the alphabet, it's probably the single most malleable and flexible form that human beings use. So what I wanted to do was to create the most neutral alphabet. And in order to do so, I used a beautiful book by Dr. Peter Caro of URW called Typeface Statistics, which analyzes all of the possible positions of a range of typefaces. All of them happen to be published by URW at the time, and creates a complete mapping of all the possible locations for the tail of a G or the counterform of an O. And by taking that statistical data and by making a very detailed analysis of a large number of sans serif typefaces, and by using something which type designers would tell you is both corrupt, immoral, and illegal, called interpolation, I went through a whole series of iterations looking at large numbers of possible letter forms to create what I thought at the time was the least noticeable typeface. Interestingly, Kai Bernau, or is it Cal, I'm not quite sure, has recently created, published through Typotech, a fantastic font called Neutral, which does exactly this and is much better. Go and buy it. So this is the final grid of the forms, which shows all of the functions that you need within a typeface, stroke modulation, overshoot or overdraw on all of the curves, and variable measurements within the ascent, the descent, the X height, so on and so forth. This is the kind of distilled basis for an alphabetic construction. But at the next stage, what I wanted to do was completely regulate that, because I'm really interested in doing anything that breaks the rules. So where there's an instruction that a curve must overshoot the baseline or the ascent height, I wanted just to mathematicize that. And this is the grid of the mathematicized form. So the first typeface is called core optical, and this is it. It's not a thing in itself. It's more of the basis for a series of experiments which I'm about to show you. But this is its geometric cousin, where all of the divisions, all of the positions have been completely compressed into mathematical zones. And you can see a range of problems there that typographers and type designers would be horrified by. But in reality, when you look at the difference, when you think about it in a body of text, it's so insignificant, it really makes no odds. So I didn't construct that body of letters purely to be negative. I also wanted to use it as something that I could cut into, because my genuine interest is in the idea that text is not language. Speech is not language. These things are vehicles for language. And it is possible to... He's just shown me his wristwatch telling me to hurry up, but I'm not going to. It's my stage.
Okay, it's 3 hours then, sorry.
The notion that you can divorce form from content, that you can divorce the letter from the word, from the meaning of the word, is what I'm interested in. And it'll only stay there momentarily. You can't really do it, but you can pull it apart, a bit like pulling a butterfly apart or a flower apart. And therefore, what I have is a series of dissections, many of which are quite dull, quite boring. They're all typefaces, though. So to an extent, they're all programmatic. They're not just one-offs. They're all systems which pull the thing apart, deconstruct it, for want of a better word, and then allow you to reassemble the alphabet into new forms that you could not visualize if you were doing it by means of an act of will. So these are small samples of quite extensive books where I seek to look at every single possible variation on this broken down version of this neutral alphabet. And its final resolution is a very simple thing. It's a book consisting of 5 different zones where different pages can be lifted up and you can invent new glyphs that you couldn't anticipate otherwise. So having created that deconstructive approach, disassembly of the engine of the alphabet, I then started to produce some reconstructions using the same basic material. In this set, what happens is that everything within a text is automatically extracted and turned into just the visualization of its own punctuation. So you can take the Bible and just turn it into an iteration of its punctuation. Here, the punctuation is replaced by a word that represents the punctuation, and so on and so forth. As Hamish was saying before about his systems, one isn't concerned about whether they look right or wrong, whether they are correct or incorrect. One only wants to see them in order to be able to evaluate them. In this system, the idea is that you can take away the exoskeleton of the word and just leave the endoskeleton. So these words, which you can see in the halftone photograph on the left, they look like words when you first glance at them, but when you drill into them, they won't nourish you with any meaning or reading. And my final response to that was the creation of this poster, which is a quote from George Bush about evolution. I won't read it to you.
I don't think he could.
Symmetry is a crucial aspect of alphabetic form. So in this set, to get away from the computer, I generated a set of letters on grids and then overlaid mirrors in calibrated positions in order to find the buried symmetries within Roman letter form. And again, it's all a matter of not being able to anticipate what you might see, but having gone through large volumes of material, seeking to distill that down to try and re-engineer from that analysis a series of outputs that take aspects of what one has seen. So here's an alphabet that is symmetrical in the horizontal axis only. This alphabet is symmetrical in the vertical axis only. And the game that's being played is obviously, you know, every letter must be as minimal as possible, but must be perfectly symmetrical. This alphabet is symmetrical in both axes. It's just about readable. This has rotational symmetry. And this has symmetry in all axes, and frankly has got a bit lost, but never mind. And to test it, one has to implement these things. So there's a series of quotes. Most of them are palindromic. They can be read in different directions. Is that the right word?
Yes,
I'm not sure. Yeah. So you can flip them around, and you'll be able to read them no matter which way you look at them. One of the things I thought was particularly interesting about the relationship between the alphabet and its appearance is its relationship to the frequency of the letters in relation to the language that you're using. This system seeks to turn every word into a graph of its own letter frequency. So E's and N's and T's will always be large, and they'll always be in the same position, and they will create a text that you can't actually read, but what you can do is get some sensibility of a musical rhythm within language. This is obviously the English language, and this counterbalances frequency within frequency. So infrequent letters are large in the black form here, and frequent letters are white. The idea of frequency, then I pushed further to lose any sense of the alphabet and just push it to abstractions that represent frequency occurrence of the alphabet without any language. And at this point, I recognize two things. One is that language is somewhat like music, but also that typography moves through space in the same way that speech moves through sound. And using very simple programs like FontLab and Fontographer at the time, you can hijack that, and you can actually fold space in typography. That's what happened in those frequency words. This is frequency of a quote by Georges Perec, which I'd like to think, if I had the right instrument, could be played into a different kind of linguistic iteration. Pitch, duration, all of those things are present here without any residue of linguistic form. And that led me to the idea that I could take words, I could take strings of characters, and this is a tiny fragment of a very large body of characters, and by mapping them on top of each other, could use them to create something like glyphic form, something like characters. So at this point, I've moved totally away from the origin of the idea towards a system in which, in a space of about 20 minutes, using only FontLab and InDesign and those strings of characters, one can create 66,553 variant forms. So these are quite long books, and I've got about 50 of them. One has to just change the seed point, the original set of components, and it totally transforms the appearance of the output. It's possible to look at things like black letter or LED lettering or even calligraphy using a system of this type. It's not original. Norm did it beautifully in a fantastic book called Norm the Things, and I'm very happy to acknowledge that, and they've been very supportive in the development of what I've been doing. This kind of work, this kind of approach, which is all about setting conditions and rules and then playing them out and seeing what happens, is something that Hamish has been fascinated by in his typographic work. It's something I've been fascinated by in the type work that I've produced.
And we thought our students ought to be fascinated by it as well.
Precisely.
And so, torture for them.
So we set up a project. In fact, Hamish originated it as a form generating project, and I stole it from him and hijacked it into
and made it better.
Well, who knows? It's a system whereby a student is obliged to play the lottery, come into class with a lottery ticket, which you can see, that pink thing, and then has to fill out these little white squares with compositions that relate to the numbers that they've been given. The students have no idea why they're being asked to do that. If this kind of workshop takes off, if any of your students are asked to do this, you'll now know why you have to spend maybe 2-3 days in absolute agony trying to make black compositions on white bits of paper. Excuse me. But the ultimate resolution of this is in a series of large format pieces in which the students have really acted like ants following pheromone trails to construct really quite interesting conditional objects. Each quadrant of what you're looking at there is based on the numbers the students have been given, which is, there are 6 different numbers for each student, and then a set of mathematical guides or conditions like randomness or symmetry in the vertical axis. Of course, at least 10% of students will not understand anything you're saying and will ruin it totally. But occasionally, it works really well. So that's a piece of work which is several meters across. You can see a person at bottom left. And they work in very similar ways, I think, to the earlier typographic stuff. It's just it's easier for me because I get students to do it for me. Georges Perec is a real touch point. And his idea, he was criticized really heavily once for writing a book which nobody liked and got panned really badly in the press. But nobody had noticed that this book didn't use any E's whatsoever. And so he was really interested in the materiality of language and the way you can play with that. And he wrote a piece in a French newspaper in defense of his work where he said, there are 2 ways of getting water. You can go to the spring and bring it back in buckets, or you can lay down pipework and pumps to make it play before your eyes. It's the same water either way. I think Hamish and I would both subscribe to the pipework approach. Which leads us to what we're doing today and how our collaboration has come about.
Yeah. So the first project that MuirMcNeil did was eventually published by Fonts. It's 3.6, and it's a geometric typeface, or a series of geometric typefaces which are constructed on very strict rule systems. But what we were interested in was seeing if we could intervene, again geometrically, to try and move the letter forms towards forms which might be more legible at small sizes. The whole thing is based on a grid, as you can see. It's called 3.6 because the spaces between the larger blue dots are for they're units of 4 nines, which is 36. And part of the kind of parametric investigation was to see whether we could modulate weight by mathematical expansion and contraction of the contours. So everything is geometric, and there are 6 typefaces, and each of them comes in 8 weights. And I think the interesting thing for me, well, for us both probably, about 3.6 is one of the things that's kind of nice about it is that for every weight, it's the same set length. So if you change the weight, you don't change the length of the setting. And then these are the interventions that we made. So that's the basic form, the 3.6.10 as we called it. And the first thing that we looked at was trying to mitigate for the fact that purely geometric vertical and horizontal strokes are not in the correct balance. Could we do something to de-stress the horizontal strokes. So the first thing we looked at was just putting these stencil gaps in the cross strokes.
One of the main concerns was that this kind of lettering is very often used for display. It's very often used at large sizes, but you don't put this kind of thing into text. So we were thinking, you know, how would you have to adjust a straight-jacketed, mathematical, rigid, vertical and horizontal letter form in order to work at 6-point or 12-point? And these different iterations seek to make interventions at the junctions, at the terminals, to hopefully make that work, partially make that work. It's not 100% successful, but it's an interesting experiment as far as we're concerned.
And the idea is that at 6 or 8-point, in the case of this typeface, the horizontal strokes haven't been turned into dots. The dots disappear, but the eye perceives the strokes as being thinner. But actually, although it was meant to be, it started as a research project to try and design optically modulated geometric typefaces. We really like the big stuff, or when it's big. And the final version just takes away the central dot of the previous one. It was published by Unit Editions in one of their research papers. When was this, 2010?
2010, yeah. Now out of print.
Where we showed sample setting in various weights and sizes and kind of proved that it did work. Quite a good testing ground because it was a newsprint publication. And that kind of led on to an invitation from Tony Brooke, who curated the Wim Crowell exhibition at the Design Museum in London in 2011, to inviting us, along with 6 other design groups who had connections to or relationships with Crowell, to design a poster for sale in the museum shop. It wasn't the exhibition poster. And they were the same format as Crowell's posters for the Stedelijk Museum. And the brief was to try and echo Crowell's grid, to do something based on his grid. And it was a bit like one of the most scary things that we'd ever worked on, really, because it's a bit like being asked to design a poster for God, you know. So we spent a long time on this, and I think we generated about, 450 different iterations when we were trying to...
a long time in the pub.
Yeah, talking about it, arguing with each other. And there's not much to say apart from it's just very sad that 2 gentlemen of our age can spend so long working on one poster.
But that's just English self-deprecation. This kind of approach, we think, is actually one of the most interesting things we've ever done. And the very fact that the only time these things have ever seen the light of day are at this presentation is quite a joy to us.
And a little bit on Twitter, if you've been following recently. But as a series of experiments of trying to work towards something with no ideas, but only trying to make a typographic response using 3/6, along the way we came across some interesting accidents and mistakes, and this is kind of linear. This is the chronological order in which they were done.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Hamish has just said, with no ideas, as if we're sort of animals or robots. The fact is that when we said at the beginning that there may be knots, one of the things we really dislike is ideas. We're not interested in ideas. We're only interested in form and the structure of form, the hierarchy of form. So we don't want to say anything other than what it is.
It is this. So we started thinking that maybe we should not ignore the brief and start to use Crowell's grid. So these gridded posters are trying to engineer letter forms around the grid. And some of these led to other work later. As a series of experiments, we've taken some of the ideas in these and used them in a recent project.
How many are there? 235?
Too many. It's going to get quicker. But coming up, ooh. That's the one I wish we'd done.
I don't like it.
He doesn't like it. I still like it. But it got simpler and bad, and then better. And this is, okay, watch. Ooh. Made all the difference. 9 more units. And that's the final poster, which is three-colour silkscreen. So the black is metallic black and gunmetal grey and silver. A recent MuirMcNeil project. Paul.
A man named Jeremy Bentham invented the panopticon, I think in the mid-1800s. It's a kind of building, institutional building, which you can use to watch the inmates of the building. So it's for prisons or lunatic asylums. And the idea is you have social control because they don't know they're being watched, and therefore they have to behave in case they are being watched.
A bit like his students in those workshops.
And so this is a typeface that works with that idea of multiple viewpoint. It's typeface available in 4 different perspectives or orthographic projections, and in a series of layers, a perimeter layer, and then a series of overlays, which can be used to, in a single layer, as shown here, to make extraordinarily blocky forms, or I'm not sure if we've got anything much more detailed here. But you have a view from the top, a view from the side, a view from the bottom, a view from the left and the right. And the reason we've designed these more recent projects is not just to create letterform, not just to see if we can sell the typefaces, but simply as components in poster design. So this is the final design for the panopticon poster,
which is 100 by 70 centimetres, 2-colour silkscreen.
Fluorescent. Fluorescent ink, or just colour, is totally at variance with the simplicity of designing letterform.
Note, roots, orange.
Ah.
Other orange, it's good.
Oh, yeah, good. So that's Panopticon. Interact.
This has its roots in a project that 8VO did for an American design journal back in 1994. We were asked to submit a thing about interactive typography. And we designed a typeface, which we called Interact, which was kind of based on looking at Krauls Formgeber's lettering for the Stedelijk Museum poster in 1968. Don't know if you can see, but it has these interesting kind of corner junctions, which, although everything it's all straight lines, the corners are sort of softened. And in an earlier job that we did for, this is kind of a prototype for Interact. It's an article for Blueprint magazine about, the future of soft signage. And this is its application on the thing we did for the American Journal. But we designed Interact, and it's a series of 4 typefaces of fixed size. So they're all mapped to the same grid, and the modulation of the kind of corner junctions gets cruder as the sizes go down because they have to fit on the grid. And we've recently revived this, and we've published it in 4 sizes, and we've kind of done the contour mapping a trick again, so various sizes have various weights available, depending upon how they fit on the grid and how the maths works. And I think our intention for these typefaces is that, not only could they be good for print, but they might also be interesting to use in animation and on screen. And we're just about to commission a filmmaker to work with us, producing some test animations of our new typefaces. And again, the poster that we've just published.
So 9 is really a reworking of our earlier 3/6 typeface, in which we've tried to really simplify it and cut it down to something much more basic. There's not a huge amount to say about it. It's a very straightforward typeface. One of the rules that we're stepping over, I suppose, is the idea that a typeface has to have an ascent and a descent, and everything has to fall within that bounding box. So weight is added laterally, but it's much more difficult to add it vertically. So we thought, well, why not just ignore that totally and just put the bulk of the letter onto a continuous heart line or center line. It makes life so much easier. And it's far more systematized. So what you've been seeing is the two variations, the metric version, which is vari-spaced, and the mono version, which obviously is mono-spaced. Like all of our other things, it goes through a series of weights, and those weights are carefully incremented, and everything can be calculated numerically by the user, and that's then been resolved in a two-color poster using fluorescent, or one fluorescent and one non-fluorescent.
You can see a theme developing here.
Fluorescent.
Posters.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, there's detail shots, whoopee. Yeah. Completely forgotten.
It's uncanny, that orange resemblance.
Right, I'm not going to go back.
And then the fourth thing that we've recently published is called Intersect, and this kind of came out of some of those Crowell poster experiments. So it's an incredibly crude, well, it's not a bitmap, is it? What is it? It's a grid map font, which comes with one skeleton but two weights. And to introduce the idea of weights, we've kind of used a series of textures, if you like. So the same texture grid is applied to both typefaces, and it produces this number of variations. I can't count. I think it's, well, whatever. There's lots of them. And the idea is that you can use the typefaces on their own, or perhaps a bit more interestingly, start to combine them together. So here you can see echoes of some of the things that we discovered in the Crowell posters.
You know, the game we're playing here is that letter form can only be black or white. So you can only change weight by adding blackness. But if you intervene in the texture of the letter and the surface of the letter, you can create a kind of bogus screen pattern. That was the basic idea, but then we recognized that by overlapping the screen patterns, you can get some quite unexpected and interesting treatments and effects, which leads us towards the poster.
It does now.
Good.
So this one's printed in 3 colors. And we're coming to the end. But there is one more slide.
Thank you.
Thank you. What do we do now? We just disappear.
Okay.
Thank you.